The job posting appeared on my screen at 11:47 a.m. on a Tuesday. I remember the exact time because I'd been refreshing the same employment website for 3 hours straight, watching positions disappear and reappear like a cruel game. Most required experience I didn't have, or backgrounds I couldn't fabricate. This one was different. Vague enough to seem real, professional enough not to be obvious. Nanny needed, Manhattan, competitive salary. That last part made my stomach clench. Competitive meant they weren't looking for desperate, which meant they might actually hire someone. My apartment in Brooklyn was 3 months behind on the kind of rent that shouldn't exist for a place this small. The lease agreement had words like subject to increase and market rate adjustment, which apparently meant the landlord could do whatever he wanted. Margaret, my mother, had offered money again last week during our Sunday call. She'd done it carefully, as if asking me to borrow from my own mother was something I could refuse without breaking. David, my brother, had left a check in my mailbox the month before. $500. I'd never deposited it. The thought of accepting money from a cop made my throat tight in ways I couldn't explain. I'd been a teacher for 8 years. Loved it in the way people love things that slowly destroy them. Elementary education, kindergarten through 3rd grade. I was good at it. Parents requested my classroom, kids learned, test scores climbed. Then I noticed something that good teachers aren't supposed to notice. Or rather, good teachers are supposed to notice but not say anything. There were 4 other teachers in the upper grades taking money from families. Not tuition, not donations. Direct payments for inflated grades, for students who hadn't earned advancement. I watched it happen twice before I realized what I was seeing. Then I spent 3 weeks convinced I was wrong before I finally went to the district superintendent. The district superintendent had listened very carefully while I explained everything. He'd taken notes. He'd nodded at appropriate moments. Then he'd asked me to wait in the conference room while he confirmed my findings. I'd waited for 40 minutes. When he came back, his expression had already decided my future without consulting me about it. The other 4 teachers had attorneys. I had a diploma and 8 years of solid performance reviews. By the end of the process, I was the problem. Instability in the workplace, creating hostile environment, suggesting improprieties without adequate evidence. The school board voted 6-3 to terminate. No severance, no reference. Just a letter saying my employment had been concluded due to conduct unbecoming of an educator. Nobody wanted to hire someone the school system had terminated. It didn't matter why. The reason didn't survive the first interview question. By month 6 of unemployment, I'd stopped mentioning the actual incident and started telling people I'd decided to explore other opportunities. They still didn't hire me. By month 8, I'd just started applying for anything that didn't require teaching certification. The phone call for the first interview came on a Wednesday. The woman on the line had a professional voice that gave nothing away. She said the position was with a private family, competitive salary, live-in or live-out options available. She asked if I could meet on Friday afternoon. I said yes, before she finished the sentence. The office was in Midtown, on the 42nd floor of a building that probably had a name I'd never remember. All glass and steel and people who looked like they'd never questioned anything in their lives. The man who interviewed me introduced himself only as an assistant. He didn't give a first name. His questions were standard. Experience with children, emergency response training, references. I answered them the way I'd learned to answer them. Truthful enough to be convincing, careful enough to be safe. He didn't ask about my termination. He didn't ask about anything that mattered. After 30 minutes, he shook my hand and said they'd be in touch. I almost didn't go to the second interview. The address they provided was an apartment building on Upper West Side, not an office. I called the number they'd given me to confirm it was legitimate. The same woman with the professional voice assured me it was. I arrived at 2:15 p.m. on a Monday. The lobby was enormous and quiet, the kind of quiet that means money. The doorman didn't look at me twice when I gave him the apartment number. The penthouse took up the entire top floor. That became obvious the moment the elevator doors opened into a private foyer. The man waiting for me was standing near a window that framed the entire city, or at least the part of it that mattered to people like him. He was tall, dark hair. There was a scar that traced from his right cheekbone down to his jaw, and something about that detail felt important. He wore a suit that made the one I was wearing seem like a costume. His eyes were dark brown, almost black, and they assessed me the way people assess things they're considering buying. "Ms. Cooper," he said. Not a question. A confirmation. "I'm Lucas Ravellini. Thank you for coming." His handshake was firm, but not aggressive. The kind that people practice until it becomes exactly what they want it to be. He gestured toward a sitting area. Leather furniture, abstract art, everything positioned to suggest wealth without announcing it loudly. He didn't offer coffee or water. He didn't make small talk. "This position requires discretion," he began. "I need someone who can care for my son and understand that what happens in my home remains in my home. Can you do that?" "Yes," I said. "You won't be asking questions about my work?" "No." He studied me for another moment, and I realized I'd passed whatever that first test was. My son is 4. He's intelligent, capable of manipulation, and currently refusing nannies. His last 4 caregivers left because he rejected them. I'm going to have him choose the person who works with him. You'll be one of 5 candidates. He'll choose one. That person will be hired. The logic of it was strange, letting a 4-year-old make employment decisions. But I understood immediately what he was actually saying. He wasn't testing nannies. He was testing children's intuition, which meant something had happened to make him trust a child's judgment more than his own. "When?" I asked. "Friday evening, here, you and 4 other women. Mateo will be present. Then he decides." I should have asked more questions. Should have expressed concern about the arrangement or requested clarification about my actual responsibilities. Instead, I said, "I'll be here," and he walked me to the elevator without another word. Friday arrived with the kind of weight that comes before something changes. I wore simple clothes, dark pants, a green blouse the color of shallow water, no jewelry except my watch, no perfume. I wanted to be neutral, undemanding, almost invisible. The women who arrived before me were not invisible. The first one wore heels that probably cost more than I made in a month. The second had a diamond ring that caught light like it was personally offended by darkness. The third arrived with a designer bag and the kind of smile that suggested she'd never heard the word no. The fourth wore something that might have been Prada. I couldn't tell anymore. I'd been away from that world too long. They circled Mateo like he was a prize to be won. They offered toys pulled from expensive bags. They promised Disneyland and theme parks and adventures. They laughed loudly and touched him constantly and treated him like he was something to be performed for. Mateo looked increasingly trapped. Lucas watched from a chair positioned at the edge of the room, holding a glass of something amber. He didn't look at the women. He looked at me. And more specifically, he watched what I did after I realized that approaching the child like the others had wasn't going to work. I sat down on the floor, not kneeling, not assuming a subservient position, just sitting, the way someone sits when their legs stop working. I waited. The 4 other women continued their performance. Mateo's eyes began to dart between them and me. He looked confused. Then something in his face shifted. Probably he was old enough to recognize desperation, even if he didn't have a word for it yet. Desperation to be liked, to be chosen, to win. I wasn't desperate to be liked. I was just sitting on the floor. 15 minutes passed. Mateo started to cry. Not the performed cry he'd been using earlier. This was different, confused and overwhelmed. The cry of a small person who'd been given too much attention too quickly and couldn't process it. The 4 women immediately stopped their performance and looked at Lucas, waiting for instruction. I reached out slightly and waited. I didn't move closer. I didn't extend my hand further than my body. I just indicated, through the smallest possible gesture, that I was here if he wanted me. Mateo moved toward me like I'd pulled him with a rope. He buried his face in my chest, and his whole body shook with the kind of crying that comes from somewhere real. The other women exchanged glances. One of them checked her phone. Another adjusted her bag. Lucas set down his glass. "Monday," he said to me, not to them. "You start Monday. 1-month contract. We'll see how it works." The other women were still leaving their contact information, still talking about their experience, still competing for something they'd already lost. I didn't look at them. I was focused on the small body pressed against me, on the fact that this child, traumatized, testing, wounded in ways I hadn't yet identified, had somehow recognized that I wasn't performing anything, that I was just present, that sometimes, for a person who'd learned not to trust, presence is enough. My alarm went off at 6:30 on my first Monday, though I'd been awake since 5. The penthouse was silent in that particular way that only existed in places where money had purchased quiet. No neighbors, no city noise filtering through thin walls, just the sound of my own breathing and the weight of everything I didn't understand about this job. The room Lucas had given me was on the second floor, separated from Mateo's bedroom by a hallway and 3 closed doors. It was decorated in shades of gray and white, furniture that looked expensive but felt untouched, like a hotel room that had never actually been lived in. I'd unpacked my possessions in approximately 4 minutes. My wardrobe looked pathetic, hanging in the walk-in closet that could have housed a family of 4. Mateo didn't come looking for me that first morning. Instead, I heard him moving around the floor above at 6:45, the kind of movement that suggested he was jumping on furniture. I climbed the back staircase, found his room, and discovered him mid-leap on his bed, still wearing pajamas covered in dinosaurs. "Good morning," I said from the doorway. I didn't ask permission to enter. I didn't make a big show of appearing. I just materialized, the way Hannah would be part of this routine, whether he wanted it or not. He landed hard on his backside and stared at me for a long moment. Then he said, "You're the one." "Yes, I'm the one. Are you going to leave?" His voice was small, smaller than it should have been for a 4-year-old. "No," I said. "That's the arrangement. I'm not a maybe. I'm a yes." He considered this with the gravity of someone much older, then flopped backward on his mattress. "Okay, I'm hungry." Breakfast became the first real test. Mateo wanted cereal that I couldn't find. He described it using words that didn't quite make sense. Something about dinosaurs and colors and crunchy things. I didn't dismiss him. I didn't tell him we'd eat something else. I looked through every cabinet in the kitchen while he supervised from his position at the granite island, and when I couldn't locate his specific brand, I sat down beside him and said, "Tell me exactly where you saw it last." He directed me to a cabinet I'd already checked 3 times. But this time I noticed the box wedged behind the organic granola Lucas probably purchased and never ate. Mateo watched as I retrieved it, poured it into a bowl, added milk, and slid it in front of him. He ate methodically, seeming to measure whether this qualified as proof of commitment. The next few weeks followed a similar pattern. He would test me in ways both obvious and subtle, refusing lunch, then watching to see if I'd force the issue or present alternatives. Waking at 2 a.m, screaming from nightmares and observing whether I appeared irritated or just appeared. Taking a toy without asking, and pausing at the door to see what my reaction would be. I didn't pass every test perfectly. I was tired on the 4th day and snapped when he spilled juice, but I apologized immediately. I explained that my tiredness was about me, not about him. I showed him that I was human in ways his other nannies apparently hadn't bothered to be. By week 3, he had stopped asking if I was leaving. Lucas maintained distance during this period. He existed in the apartment the way ghosts exist in old houses, present but separated by invisible walls. I'd see him in the morning sometimes, stepping out of his office with coffee that he'd clearly made himself, always black, never adding anything to it. He'd ask how Mateo was doing, and I'd report factually. No editorializing, no complaining. He'd nod and disappear again. Then came the night he called me into his office. It happened after Mateo had fallen asleep on a Thursday. I was reading in my room, working through a book I'd started 3 weeks ago, and hadn't had time to finish, when his voice came through the intercom. "Ms. Cooper, could you come to my office?" The 3rd floor was where I never went. Mateo's nanny duties didn't require me to enter Lucas's workspace, and he hadn't invited me further than the kitchen and living areas. The office was exactly what I'd expected. All dark wood and glass, walls lined with books that probably weren't decoration, a desk that faced the door with military precision. He was standing when I entered, shirt sleeves rolled up, and he looked less like a businessman and more like someone who'd been carved from necessity itself. "Sit," he said, not unkindly, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. "Is something wrong? With Mateo?" I asked immediately, Still standing? Mateo is fine. He's asleep. He's been asleep for 2 hours. Lucas moved to a bar in the corner of the room and poured amber liquid into 2 glasses. He offered one to me. I shook my head. He shrugged and sat back down, the glass untouched on the desk beside him. You said you wouldn't ask questions about my work. I won't. I need to know that you mean that. I need to know that you understand what you've agreed to. Something in the way he said it made me sit down, made me really listen. Not just hear words, but process them. Lucas was a dangerous man. I could tell that from every interaction, from the way people moved around him with careful precision, from the scars that covered his body like a map of survival. But I hadn't understood until that moment, looking at his face in the lamplight, that his danger wasn't directed at me. It was peripheral. It was context. I understand, I said. He picked up the glass he'd poured for himself and took a long drink. Then he said, 3 years ago, my daughter died. Her name was Lucia. She was 5 years old. My ex-wife was driving her home from my apartment. A car hit them on the FDR Drive. It wasn't an accident. I didn't breathe. My daughter died in the hospital at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday. My ex-wife made it through the night and died the next morning at 6:15. He delivered these facts the way someone delivers coordinates. Precise. Absolute. My brother arranged both deaths. His name is Marco. He wanted control of our family business. I wasn't moving fast enough for him, so he decided to remove variables. Mr. Ravellini, let me finish. His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. I didn't remove him. He's still alive. He's still a part of my operation, because removing him would have made things more complicated. But I made certain he understood what had happened, what the cost of that decision was going to be. I understood then why Mateo woke screaming, why he tested every single person who entered his life, why a 4-year-old had learned to move through the world like someone already wounded. Mateo's mother is Sofia Bellini, a woman I was involved with before Lucia died. When Lucia died, Sofia decided this wasn't the life she wanted. She took Mateo to Miami. We come to an arrangement every year on his birthday. She sends a gift. She calls. She's trying to stay away from this world. Lucas stood and moved to the window. The city sprawled beneath us, unaware that in this glass box, a man was confessing things he probably shouldn't. You're here because Mateo needs someone who won't run when this becomes too real. You're here because I needed to show my family that I could create stability even after everything fell apart. You're here because a 4-year-old child chose you out of 5 women, and I've learned to trust his instincts more than my own. I'm being used. I said it not as accusation, but as statement. Yes, you are. You're a tool, but you're a tool that my son has bonded with, and that changes the equation. He turned back to face me. So here's what matters. Mateo isn't going to remember his sister. Lucia is a ghost in this apartment. The nightmares are because his body remembers even if his mind doesn't. Every time he wakes up terrified, he's processing something he shouldn't have to process. Every time he tests you, he's checking whether this grief will make you disappear like everyone else did. What do you need from me? The question came out smaller than I intended. I need you to stay, even when it's hard. Even when he hurts you because he's hurting himself. I need you to be the person who doesn't leave. That's everything. I left his office without another word. Walked through the penthouse that suddenly felt like it was holding its breath. Climbed the stairs to Mateo's room and watched him sleep. This child who was carrying his father's trauma in his small body, who had learned to move through the world like someone already broken before he was old enough to understand breaking. I understood then what I'd actually agreed to. It wasn't a job. It was a choice. And the choice wasn't really mine anymore. It belonged to this child who'd chosen me, and to the damaged, dangerous man who was trying to raise him inside a world designed to destroy everything soft. I went back to my room and didn't sleep. Some choices don't permit rest. I had been there for 6 weeks when Marco appeared. Not suddenly. Gradually, the way poison enters a system. Small doses that go unnoticed until the damage is already done. The first time I saw him was in the morning. Lucas was leaving his office as I helped Mateo with breakfast, and there was a man behind him. Gray hair, a scar that ran along his neck, partially hidden by a silk scarf that seemed designed specifically to draw attention to it. He looked at Mateo the way some people look at investments. "Ms. Cooper," Lucas said. His voice, flat in a way I was learning, meant something was wrong. "This is my brother, Marco." He was just leaving. Marco smiled. Not the kind of smile that involved warmth. The kind that used the lips as a weapon. "So, this is the famous Nanny. The one who captured our little Mateo's heart." "I'm just doing my job," I said, keeping my hand on Mateo's shoulder. "Of course you are." He looked at Mateo directly then. "Your father tells me you're very happy with Miss Cooper, that she's becoming very important to you." Mateo's body stiffened against me. He didn't answer. Lucas moved between them. "Marco, you have somewhere to be." After that, I noticed Marco coming regularly. Thursdays, mostly, sometimes Wednesdays. He'd arrive in the afternoon and disappear into Lucas's office, and I'd hear muffled voices that occasionally rose to something approaching aggression. Mateo would become withdrawn on those days, pulling into himself like a plant wilting under fluorescent light. His nightmares came more frequently. His testing behavior intensified. It was on a Thursday when I made the mistake of being in the hallway outside Lucas's office while Marco was there. I wasn't trying to listen. I was carrying laundry down to the utility room on the ground floor and happened to pass the slightly open office door. What I heard stopped me in place. "She's a tool, Lucas. Nothing more. She serves her purpose right now. Shows the council that you're stable, that you can maintain normalcy around your heir. But she's also a weakness." Marco's voice carried the particular confidence of someone who'd never been wrong about anything. "A woman like that, she'll eventually understand what you are, what your world demands. She'll leave. And when she does, you'll look weak. You'll look like you've lost control." I should have kept walking. The laundry in my arms was still warm from the dryer, and I needed to get it to the bedrooms before Mateo's bedtime routine. But I stood in the hallway, invisible, listening. "Hannah isn't going anywhere," Lucas said. "How do you know? Because a 4-year-old boy chose her? Mateo chooses based on emotion, not logic. He'll attach to anyone who shows him basic kindness. Give it time. When the novelty wears off, when she realizes that loving you means living with the constant threat of violence, when she understands that her safety is contingent on your ability to maintain power, she'll run. They always run." There was a long pause. I imagined Lucas standing at his window, looking out at the city like it owed him something. "If she runs, then she wasn't the right person anyway," he finally said. "And if she doesn't? If she stays?" Marco laughed, and it was the kind of laugh that suggested he already knew how the story ended. "Then you've given her leverage. A woman who stays in this world becomes a liability. She'll know too much. She'll be a security risk. You'll have to decide whether to keep her close or eliminate the problem." The laundry basket grew heavier in my arms. I understood then what I'd already suspected, but hadn't fully accepted. I was being used. Not maliciously, perhaps, but deliberately. I was a chess piece, and Lucas was calculating whether I was worth the space I took up on the board. I went downstairs and folded the laundry with hands that felt like they belonged to someone else. By the time Marco left 2 hours later, I'd convinced myself that it didn't matter. I was staying for Mateo, not for Lucas. The difference seemed important then. That night, after Mateo fell asleep, I sat on his bedroom floor and watched him dream. His face was peaceful in sleep, all the tension and fear temporarily suspended. When he woke up, he'd go back to his tests. He'd check whether I was still here. He'd measure my commitment through the small wounds he could inflict and monitor how I reacted. I understood that now. He was doing to me what the world was doing to him, measuring capacity for betrayal. I must have fallen asleep on his floor because I woke to complete darkness and the knowledge that something was catastrophically wrong. Not a sound, not a light, just the absence of something essential. The air felt wrong. The silence felt wrong. I knew before I opened my eyes that Mateo's bed was empty. His blankets were tangled on the mattress. The window was closed and locked from the inside. His nightlight still cast its lavender glow across the empty space where he should have been. I ran. Screaming his name, I ran through the hallway to Lucas's bedroom. He was already awake, already moving. My panic must have communicated itself because he didn't ask questions. He just grabbed his phone and made 3 calls while pulling on clothes. Each call was a single sentence delivered in a voice that sounded like it was carved from stone. "He's gone. Central Park. Send everyone." The next hours existed in a state of suspended reality. I sat in Mateo's room while Lucas coordinated the search through his phone. His men moved through the penthouse, checking every location, every window, every possibility. I held his stuffed rabbit and tried not to imagine scenarios that my mind kept generating anyway. At 1:47 a.m., Lucas's phone rang. He listened to something, and his entire body went rigid. Then he was moving, kissing the top of my head without seeming to notice he was doing it, and saying, "I'll be back with him." He was gone for 53 minutes. I counted them. One, and every single one felt like watching blood leak from a wound I couldn't apply pressure to. When he returned, Mateo was asleep in his arms. The child's pajamas were wet with dew. His hair was damp. He looked smaller somehow, diminished by whatever had happened in the hours he'd been gone. I took him from Lucas without asking questions, carried him to his bed and lay beside him, my entire body vibrating with a fear so complete it felt like I might fracture into pieces. "Marco," Lucas said from the doorway. His voice was level, which was somehow worse than if he'd been shouting. He wanted to test the security, wanted to see if he could take Mateo without triggering the system. He wanted to see if I'd come. "Did you come?" I asked. "I came." That was all he said before he left again. I stayed with Mateo until morning, my hand on his chest, feeling his small heart beat against my palm. When he woke up, he asked if I loved him. I said yes. He asked if I was going to leave. I said no. He asked how he could be sure. I didn't have an answer that satisfied either of us. So I just held him closer and made a choice I didn't know I was making. I was staying, not because of Lucas, not even because of some noble idea about what Mateo needed. I was staying because Marco was right about one thing. I already knew too much. And running now would be a betrayal so complete it would confirm every fear this traumatized child carried. I'd become essential to his survival, which meant I'd become trapped here too. We were both prisoners now. The only difference was that he'd been born into it, and I'd walked into it willingly. 3 days after Mateo disappeared and was found in Central Park, Lucas called me to his office. Not with an intercom this time, but in person. He appeared at my bedroom door just after I'd put Mateo down for his afternoon nap, his presence filling the entire hallway with something heavy and unavoidable. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. His shirt was untucked. His dark eyes had taken on a hollowness that suggested he'd been staring at things no one should have to see. "I need to talk to you," he said. Not a request, not a question. A statement that left no room for negotiation. I followed him down to the 3rd floor, to that office that had become the epicenter of every significant conversation we'd had. He didn't offer me anything to drink this time. He didn't sit. He stood at the window with his hands pressed against the glass, as if trying to push through it into some other version of New York, where none of this existed. "You asked me a question last week," I said, before he could begin. I needed to establish that I'd been paying attention, that I wasn't the kind of person who'd accept convenient half-truths. "You told me about your daughter. You said she was 5 and that your ex-wife took her to Miami. But that's not the real story, is it?" He turned slowly, studying my face with an intensity that made me understand why people were afraid of him. "What makes you think there's a different story? Because Mateo wakes up at 3 in the morning screaming. Because you look at him sometimes like you're measuring whether he'll survive what you can't protect him from. Because Marco visits and Mateo gets quieter and quieter each time." I sat down without permission, crossing my legs as if I had any authority in this room. Because nothing about this situation makes sense unless there's something much worse underneath it. Lucas moved from the window and poured himself whiskey from the decanter on his bar. He drank it in one long swallow, then poured again. Only then did he speak. And his voice sounded like it was coming from very far away, as if he was narrating something that had happened to someone else entirely. "Lucia was my daughter. Catherine's daughter, too. She was 5 years old. She lived with Catherine in Park Slope, and I had her every weekend and most holidays. We had an arrangement, Catherine and I. Civil. Organized. The way divorced people manage when they've decided they can't be together but still care enough to cooperate." He paused. And in that pause, I could hear the weight of every word he was about to speak. 3 years ago in March, I was supposed to pick her up on a Friday. Catherine was going to drop her at my apartment around 4 in the afternoon. They never made it. On the FDR Drive, heading downtown, a vehicle hit theirs deliberately. The collision was orchestrated. Another car accelerated directly into them from the driver's side. My stomach began to do something complicated and involuntary. Catherine was trapped in the vehicle for 40 minutes while paramedics worked to extract her. By the time they got her out, she was already losing consciousness. Internal bleeding they couldn't stop. She made it through the night in ICU. Saturday morning at 6:15, her body simply decided it was finished. Lucas set down his glass and looked directly at me. Lucia was in the back seat. The impact crushed that entire side of the vehicle. When I found her at the hospital, she was conscious. She kept asking for her mother. She kept saying her leg hurt. The doctors thought she'd survive. Broken femur, internal bruising, nothing that should have been fatal. He walked to his desk and opened a drawer, pulling out a photograph. He didn't show it to me. He just held it, looking at something I couldn't see. By midnight, a blood clot that nobody had identified had moved to her lungs. She went into respiratory distress at 11:23. She was gone by 11:47. The office became very quiet. The kind of quiet that happens after something has been irrevocably broken. The investigation determined it was intentional. The driver of the vehicle used a burner phone to coordinate the collision. The car was reported stolen 10 minutes after impact. No suspects, no leads, just 2 dead people and 1 case file that went nowhere. Marco, I said. Marco? Yes. He wanted me to step down from running the family. He'd been pressuring me for years. Small things at first. Questioning decisions at council meetings. Suggesting I was getting soft. That Lucia was making me weak. That I cared more about her than I cared about maintaining power. Lucas set down the photograph face down on his desk. When I didn't respond to pressure, he decided to make his point using finality as a language. Why didn't you kill him? The question came out harder than I intended, and it surprised both of us. Because killing him would have required explaining why to the council. Explaining would have meant admitting that my brother orchestrated the deaths of my child and ex-wife, that I had failed to protect them. In my world, that's a fatal weakness. Literally. It means I can't be trusted with power if I can't protect what matters most. He walked back to the window, and I saw his reflection in the glass. For a moment, he looked like just a man. Not a dangerous one. Just someone carrying more weight than his body could reasonably hold. So instead, I left him alive. I let him continue operating. I watched him. I made certain he understood exactly what I knew. I made certain he understood that anything else he tried, anything at all, would result in his death. But I didn't kill him immediately, because that would have raised questions. Explained too much. Made me look unstable. But he's still here, I said quietly. He comes to the penthouse. He looks at Matteo like what? Lucas turned back to face me. Like he's measuring what he destroyed. Like he's making sure the damage is complete. He does that because I allow it. Because controlling him is easier than replacing him. Because maintaining the appearance of family unity is part of how I maintain power. Lucas sat down finally, and he looked completely exhausted. Because I have one surviving child. And I am determined that he grows up believing his father still has the capacity to protect him, even when the truth is that I failed before, and I could fail again. I understood then, all of it. The structure of Matteo's fear, the way he tested every interaction, his inability to believe that anyone would stay when staying involved this much danger. His father had survived the destruction of his own child through sheer force of will and brutality. And he'd decided that his remaining son would survive by learning that trust was conditional, that people left, that the world was fundamentally unsafe. Sophia, I said, Matteo's mother, she knows? She knows part of it. She was with me when Lucia died. She watched me become what I needed to become in order to survive it. She made her choice that day. She couldn't raise a child in the shadow of that kind of violence. I respect her for it. I've provided for her financially ever since. She's in Miami. She's in Miami. She sends gifts on Matteo's birthday. She calls on holidays. She exists in his life as a ghost. the way Lucia exists as a ghost. The difference is that Sophia made the choice to become a ghost. Lucia didn't have that choice. I sat back in the chair, trying to process a story that was too large to fit inside the normal boundaries of understanding. This wasn't a man who'd had something go wrong. This was a man who'd been systematically dismantled by someone he was related to, and had chosen to continue existing anyway. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. "Because I need to know that you understand what you're agreeing to. That you comprehend that Mateo's entire existence is shadowed by violence you didn't cause, but will have to live alongside anyway. That by staying, you're not just becoming his nanny. You're becoming a target." Lucas leaned forward. "That by staying, you're accepting that Marco will continue to exist in our periphery, testing boundaries, measuring whether I've truly secured what I'm trying to protect. You said something to me once," I began, searching for the right words. "You said I was a tool, that I was being used to show the council something about power and stability. I did say that. Is that still true?" Lucas was quiet for a very long time. "It's true that you serve a purpose. It's true that your presence in this apartment communicates something to the people who matter. But it's also true that Mateo has bonded with you in ways I didn't anticipate. It's true that you've changed what I thought this situation would be. It's true that I'm beginning to care whether you stay for reasons that have nothing to do with strategy." He stood and walked to the bar, but this time he didn't pour for himself. He poured 2 glasses and handed me one. I didn't drink it. I just held it, feeling the weight of the crystal. Feeling the weight of every choice I hadn't made but had fallen into anyway. "So here's what I need to know," Lucas said. "Can you stay knowing all of this? Can you commit to being present for this child while understanding that the danger is real and ongoing? Can you accept that I'm using you even as I'm trying not to use you? Can you love both of us without breaking under the weight of it?" I looked at the glass in my hands. I thought about Mateo upstairs, sleeping the sleep of a child who'd learned not to trust his own safety. I thought about Lucas carrying the corpse of his murdered daughter through 3 years of calculated vengeance. I thought about Marco waiting for his next opportunity to destroy what Lucas was trying to build. "Yes," I said, "I can stay." 3 months had passed since I first arrived at the penthouse, and the machinery of our lives had begun to shift in ways that felt both inevitable and terrifying. Lucas slept better now. Not well. Not in any way that suggested genuine peace, but the screaming had stopped. The nightmares still came, especially around 3 in the morning when the city held its breath before dawn. But now when he jolted awake with his body rigid and his breathing ragged, I was there beside him. I'd learned to recognize the moment when consciousness returned, when he remembered where he was and who was lying next to him. In those seconds, I'd see his shoulders drop, his hands unclench, his face reorganize itself around the fact that this time, nothing had been taken. Mateo had stopped asking if I was leaving. This shift happened so gradually that I almost missed it. One day he was testing every boundary, measuring my commitment through small cruelties and strategic rejection. The next, he simply began to trust. Not completely, not in the way children who hadn't been traumatized could trust, but enough that he'd occasionally reach for my hand without first checking whether I might pull away. Enough that he'd follow me through the apartment without requiring constant confirmation that I hadn't disappeared. The transition between Lucas and me had been equally gradual, equally impossible to pinpoint. Small moments accumulated into something that resembled intimacy. I'd find him in the kitchen while Mateo napped, and instead of retreating to his office, he'd stay. We'd prepare lunch together in a silence that felt less like absence and more like understanding. Our hands would brush passing plates. The contact became deliberate instead of accidental. He began leaving notes in places I'd find them. Not love letters, just observations. Something I'd said that he'd been thinking about. A reminder that he was paying attention to the specific details of my existence. One evening, standing on the penthouse balcony while Mateo slept inside, Lucas draped his suit jacket around my shoulders without asking if I was cold. I hadn't mentioned the slight chill that had settled across the terrace. He'd simply noticed my arms trembling and provided warmth, the gesture carrying an intimacy that words couldn't have matched. "Tell me something real," he said, his hands remaining on my shoulders. "Not something you've prepared, something that terrifies you." I considered lying, considered offering something manageable, something I'd already processed into safety. Instead, I said, I'm terrified that I'm not enough for him, that one day he'll remember me differently, and I'll be the person who wasn't his mother, that I'm filling a space that will always feel temporary to him, and he'll eventually understand that and resent me for it. Lucas turned me to face him. You're not filling a space. You're creating one that didn't exist before you arrived. You're not replacing anyone. You're establishing something new. 2 weeks after that conversation, he kissed me. It happened in his office on a night when Mateo had fallen asleep earlier than usual. I'd come down looking for Lucas, finding him standing at his window in that posture he often adopted, looking at the city like it owed him explanations for every terrible thing it contained. I didn't ask what he was thinking about. I simply moved closer. He turned, and his hand came up to my face with the careful precision of someone handling something fragile or dangerous. When his mouth found mine, it wasn't tentative or exploratory. It was a man who'd already made a decision and was simply confirming what he already knew. That night, we made love in his bed. Not frantically or urgently, but deliberately, with every touch carrying the weight of a choice being reaffirmed. Afterward, lying in the darkness, he said something that broke something open inside me. You can leave, he said quietly. You can take Mateo tonight. Call my people. They'll create documents that say you're his legitimate guardian. You'll disappear somewhere Marco can't reach you. I'll erase the 3 months you've been here from every record that matters. I turned to face him, his face barely visible in the darkness. Why are you telling me this? Because I need to know that you're staying by choice, that you're not trapped here by circumstance or fear, that when things get harder, and they will get harder, you're choosing to stay because you want to be here, not because you have no alternative. I'm choosing to stay, I said. Even if leaving would be safer, leaving would never be safe. Not for him. You know that. Lucas pulled me closer, his arms tightening around me. Then we're doing this. All of it. Every difficult thing that comes with this. 6 weeks after that conversation, we existed as something resembling a family. Mateo stopped his constant testing and began asking Lucas questions about things that mattered. He'd wake on weekend mornings and ask if Lucas would make breakfast instead of automatically assuming I would. He started holding both our hands sometimes when we walked through the apartment. The physical world had reorganized itself around the 3 of us, and something that had felt like a temporary arrangement was beginning to feel like permanence. Then the security alarm started malfunctioning. Small failures at first. A camera that went dark for 17 seconds. A lock that delayed before engaging. A notification that came 5 minutes late. Lucas noticed each incident before anyone else. His body going rigid in a way I'd learned meant his mind was calculating trajectories and probabilities. He'd pull me aside and ask me quietly to notice exits, to remember the service stairwells, to understand that what was happening was precisely what he'd been anticipating. The triad, he said one evening while Mateo slept. They're testing. Marco arranged it. He's using outside players to evaluate whether I've actually secured what I claimed to secure, whether Mateo is actually protected. On the night it happened, there was no warning. I was in the kitchen with Mateo, teaching him to make pasta dough. His small hands covered in flour, his concentration absolute. Lucas took a phone call in his office and his voice changed. It became the voice of someone I'd never heard before, someone carved from necessity and violence. He appeared in the doorway and looked at me with an expression that contained a single instruction. Pack a bag. Essential things only. Do it now. What's happening? I asked, already moving. Triad. Security is compromised. They're coming through the service entrance. You need to take Mateo and go. Now. I didn't ask more questions. I grabbed Mateo and a backpack I kept prepared for this specific scenario. We ran down the service stairs that Lucas had shown me weeks ago, through corridors I'd memorized for exactly this reason. Behind us, I could hear the penthouse being breached, alarms finally screaming to life too late to matter. We emerged into the New York night, and I ran. Not thinking, not reasoning. Simply moving with a child in my arms toward the one place I knew they wouldn't follow. Toward my brother David, in Brooklyn, where the Mafia of Manhattan was just a story told in bars late at night. David's apartment was exactly what the penthouse wasn't. Small. Cluttered. lived in. When he opened the door and saw me standing there with Mateo and terror written across my face, he didn't ask questions. He was a cop who understood complicated situations, but more importantly, he was my brother. "Come in," he said. "Don't worry, they won't find you here." Mateo fell asleep on David's couch, while I sat on the fire escape watching the street, every sound a potential threat, every car a possibility that they'd found us. David brought me coffee at 2 a.m. and sat beside me without speaking. Sometimes family means understanding what needs to be said and choosing silence instead. Lucas arrived at noon the next day. When I opened the door, I barely recognized him. He was covered in blood that didn't belong to him, dressed in clothes that suggested he'd been in places I didn't want to imagine. But his eyes were clear. His hands were steady. He looked at me like I was the only real thing in a world that had momentarily become theoretical. "You kept him safe," he said. Not a question. A statement of fact that seemed to matter more than anything else in existence. "Yes," I said. "Then we're building this. We're making something that survives everything Marco tries to destroy." He kissed the top of my head and walked past me to where Mateo was sleeping. And in that moment, I understood what staying truly meant. It meant witnessing a man become capable of anything to protect what he loved. It meant accepting that love in this world came with a cost measured in blood and broken bodies and impossible choices. It meant choosing to stay knowing exactly what that choice would demand from both of us. 3 weeks in David's apartment became a strange kind of purgatory. Not the worst situation, but not safety either. We existed in a state of suspended animation, waiting for Lucas to reorganize whatever had been shattered during the attack. Mateo adapted quickly to the small space, to my brother's awkward attempts at entertaining a 4-year-old, to the reality that the penthouse was no longer accessible. He didn't ask many questions about why we'd left or when we were going back. Children who'd experienced trauma understood instinctively that explanations were often lies meant to comfort adults, not truths meant to clarify situations. David moved through those 3 weeks with visible tension. As a cop, he understood exactly what Lucas Ravellini was, what his world contained, what violence looked like when it wasn't reported to the authorities. As my brother, he also understood that I'd made a choice that couldn't be unmade. The conflict played across his face every morning when he'd find me on his fire escape before dawn, watching the street like some medieval guard looking for invading armies. "You can stay here," he said one morning, bringing me terrible coffee he'd made himself. "Permanently. I can file papers. You'd have custody through legal channels. They'd never touch you. They'd find us," I said quietly. "And when they did, Lucas would level this entire neighborhood looking for us. You know that." David set down his coffee cup with deliberate care. "I know that, which is why I'm asking whether this is what you actually want, or what you've convinced yourself you have to accept." "It's both," I said. "It's always both." Lucas called every evening at 6 o'clock. Never from the same number, always brief. Always coded in language that suggested he was conducting multiple conversations on multiple levels. He'd ask about Mateo, ask if I was safe, ask if David was treating us well. Then he'd give me updates that contained information only I would understand. The triad had been dealt with. Marco had been disciplined. The penthouse was secure again. Security had been increased. Everything was ready for our return. On the 14th day, my mother Margaret arrived at David's apartment without calling first. She'd simply shown up with groceries and determination, her nurse's intuition having told her something was drastically wrong. David hadn't wanted to tell her. I'd asked him not to. But Margaret knew her children well enough to recognize catastrophe masquerading as normalcy. When she saw me on David's couch with Mateo sleeping against my shoulder, something in her face reorganized itself. She'd worked in hospitals for 40 years. She'd seen families in crisis. She understood the specific exhaustion that came from protecting someone else's survival. "Tell me," she said, sitting down across from us. I told her everything, not sparing details, not softening the reality of what Lucas was or what kind of world he inhabited. Margaret listened the way mothers listen, absorbing information not to judge but to understand what her daughter had actually chosen. When I finished, she was quiet for a very long time. "Does he treat Mateo well?" she finally asked. "Yes." "Does he treat you well?" He's trying to. He's limited by what he is. But yes. Then you have to decide whether love is something you measure by normal standards, or whether you measure it by the context you're actually living in. Margaret reached across and touched Mateo's sleeping face gently. I married your father knowing he drank. I stayed knowing it would probably destroy me. I'm not recommending that choice. I'm just saying that sometimes we love people not because they're good, but because we're invested in the specific ways they're trying to be better. On day 18, Lucas came to David's apartment himself. It was reckless. It was dangerous. It was also a statement. He walked into my brother's living room like a man declaring war on the very concept of caution, and David, recognizing the gesture for what it was, stepped back and let him approach me. Lucas looked transformed. His clothes were expensive but less formal. He'd shaved, but there was still a darkness around his eyes that suggested he hadn't slept in days. He carried something small in his hand, a box. I need to ask you something, he said, addressing me while aware that David and Margaret were both watching. And I need you to understand that my asking is not strategic. It's not about what the council thinks or what Marco might do. It's about the fact that I can't imagine continuing to exist without you. He opened the box. Inside was a ring. Not ostentatious. Not cheap. Something that existed in the space between those extremes, suggesting practicality without suggesting that wealth couldn't afford better. Marry me, he said. But understand what that means. It means you're permanently embedded in my world. It means your safety is conditional on my continued power. It means that every threat to me becomes a threat to you. It means that my enemies become your enemies. It means that if you decide to leave later, that choice becomes complicated in ways that might not be survivable. I thought about Sophia in Miami, voluntarily removing herself. I thought about Lucia, who'd never been given a choice at all. I thought about Mateo, who'd been given the option to choose me and had committed his entire future to that single decision when he was 4 years old. I need conditions, I said. Tell me. Mateo is completely separated from the business. His entire life is protected. Whatever happens, he grows up outside this. He doesn't know about it unless he chooses to know. Yes, Lucas said immediately. Marco is dealt with, not killed. I won't carry that, but removed. Somewhere he can't threaten us. He's being sent to Palermo. Family property. Indefinite exile with enough money to live comfortably, but not enough to rebuild power. Sophia is respected. Her connection to you remains financial and biological, but nothing more. She's not pulled back into this. She already made her choice to leave. I protect that choice. And my mother and David are protected. Quietly. They don't know they're being protected, but they're protected. Lucas reached out and pulled me toward him. Hannah. I already arranged that the moment I knew where you'd gone. I looked at the ring, and then at Lucas, and then at my brother and my mother, watching from across the room, and I understood that this was the moment where choice became commitment, where temporary became permanent, where the story became real. Yes, I said, I'll marry you. Lucas slipped the ring onto my finger, and it fit perfectly, which seemed like the most impossible thing about any of this. That something so measured and exact could exist in a world of chaos and violence and impossible choices. David cleared his throat. So, I guess you're leaving Brooklyn. Yes, I said. And you're going back to the penthouse. Yes. David stood and walked to Lucas and extended his hand. The grip they exchanged carried an entire negotiation. David was accepting that his sister had chosen this. Lucas was accepting that David would be watching, that a cop would be forever aware of exactly what Lucas was. It was not friendship. It was mutual recognition of boundaries. We returned to the penthouse on a weekday afternoon. The damage had been repaired. The security had been upgraded. Everything looked exactly as it had before, except for the weight of what had happened now lived inside the walls. Mateo ran to every room like he was confirming that we'd actually come back, that this hadn't been abandoned for something else. That evening, Lucas asked me to marry him again. Not with the ring this time. Just with his voice in the darkness of his bedroom. I'm already saying yes, I said. I know, but I need to ask because I need to confirm that you're choosing this every day, not just once. Every day, I promised. Even when it's hard. Especially then, he said. And I understood that this was what commitment looked like in his world. Not romantic gestures, not certainty, just the daily choice to stay, to believe, to try to build something real inside a structure designed to destroy everything soft. The wedding happened on a weekday morning at the Manhattan Marriage Bureau in the Civic Center. No church, no flowers arranged by someone else's vision. Just a judge who'd married hundreds of people in situations exactly like ours, and who didn't ask questions about the scar on Lucas's face or the protective way his hand never left my lower back. Mateo wore a suit that had been tailored to fit his small frame perfectly, and he carried the rings in a pillow that was probably worth more than my first car. When the judge asked if anyone objected, the courtroom stayed silent. My brother David sat in the back, his cop's posture rigid with the weight of understanding exactly what this ceremony meant. My mother Margaret held my hand before I walked to the judge, and she didn't speak, just squeezed once, a gesture containing everything she wanted to say but couldn't. I wore a dress in pale green that made me look less like a bride and more like someone who'd simply decided to get married. No veil, no elaborate updo, just my hair down and a single piece of jewelry Lucas had given me that morning, a necklace that contained his initials engraved inside, private, meaningful only to people who would never see it. When Lucas said his vows, he didn't recite something prepared. He looked directly at me and said, "I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to deserve this. Trying to deserve you. Trying to deserve him." He gestured toward Mateo, who was watching with the gravity of a child who understood that something permanent was happening, that the temporary had just become permanent. Marco sent a bottle of champagne. Expensive, accompanied by a card that read, "To new beginnings and old endings." Lucas looked at the bottle for a very long time before setting it aside unopened. We didn't need Marco's blessing or his irony or his continued presence in any form. 3 months after the wedding, I discovered I was pregnant. Not planned, not unexpected either. Just something that happened when two people stopped using prevention as a barrier between themselves and the future. I took the test at midnight because I couldn't sleep, and I saw the positive result and just sat on the bathroom floor of the penthouse for an hour, trying to understand how the machinery of my life had reorganized itself so completely. Lucas found me there at 2 a.m. He didn't ask questions. He just sat beside me and read the test, and then looked at my face and understood everything I was feeling without me having to translate it into words. "Are you staying?" he asked. Not, "Do you want to stay?" Not, "Can you handle this?" Just the simple question that had become the foundation of everything we'd built. "Yes," I said. "I'm staying." "Then we're having a daughter," he said. "Because you know we're having a daughter, right?" "How do you know that?" "Because the universe owes me one. And because I think you need to experience something that doesn't come with the weight of my family attached to it." Over the following weeks, as my body began to shift and change, Lucas became someone I'd never seen before, protective in ways that transcended possessiveness. He researched obstetrics, like he was preparing for military operation. He read books on pregnancy. He learned what foods I could and couldn't eat, what positions hurt, what times of day the nausea was worst. When I was at 6 weeks and vomiting for the 3rd time that morning, he held my hair back and then made me ginger tea and sat with me until the world stopped spinning. Mateo, when we told him, accepted the news with the logic of a child who'd learned that the world was less predictable than other people wanted him to believe. "Will she have my name?" he asked. "She'll have a different name," Lucas explained. "But she'll be your sister. That means you're responsible for her, for keeping her safe." Mateo considered this with absolute seriousness. "I'm good at that. I protected Hannah when you were working." The birthday invitation from Sophia arrived 3 weeks before Mateo turned 5. Not a personal letter, just an official envelope containing a gift receipt and a note. "I hope he's happy. I hope you both are happy. Tell him his mother thinks about him every day, even from a distance." Lucas showed me the letter and didn't speak about it, but I watched him read it 3 times, and I understood that some wounds never fully close. They just become part of your architecture, things you learn to move around without tearing open again. Mateo's 5th birthday party happened in the penthouse. Just family. David brought Margaret. Lucas arranged for security that was completely invisible. We decorated the living room with balloons and streamers, and Mateo was overwhelmed by the simplicity of it, the directness of celebrating him without performance or strategy. When he blew out his candles, he made a wish he wouldn't tell us about. But later, when he thought nobody was watching, I heard him tell Lucas that he'd wished for his sister to be born healthy, and for Hannah to never be scared again. That night, after Mateo had fallen asleep, Lucas and I stood on the balcony watching the city that never stopped existing, regardless of what happened inside the buildings that contained it. His hand was on my growing belly, feeling the small movements that were still barely detectable. "I've been thinking about something," he said. "About the timeline we discussed. About the possibility of actually leaving this." "Leaving how?" I asked. "In 5 years I step down. Completely. I hand over operations to someone I've been training. We take the money we've accumulated and we disappear. Not dramatically. Just transition. Mateo goes to school. You have the baby. We become invisible. Can you really do that?" "I can do anything if the reason is strong enough." He turned me to face him. "And the reason is strong enough now. I have you. I have him. I'm about to have her. That's enough. That's more than enough." The pregnancy progressed normally. The doctor Lucas hired, discreet, expensive, completely trustworthy, confirmed that everything was developing correctly. The baby was female. Everything was where it should be. At 7 months, I felt the first strong kick he could feel too. And I called Lucas from wherever he was and told him. And he came home within an hour just to put his hand on my belly and feel his daughter acknowledge her own existence. Mateo became increasingly involved in preparing for the baby's arrival. He helped me paint the nursery a soft yellow that suggested sunlight without being aggressive about it. He picked out furniture with the seriousness of someone selecting pieces for his own future. He asked questions about what babies needed and where they came from, and Lucas answered him with the same directness he'd used about everything else. No softening, no talking down. One evening, when I was 8 months pregnant and uncomfortable in ways I'd never been uncomfortable before, I found Lucas in the nursery looking at the small crib we'd assembled together. He was just standing there, staring at it like it was a portal to some version of the future he still wasn't entirely sure he deserved. "This is real," I said. It wasn't a question. "It's real," he confirmed. "And it's not going to be destroyed. I won't allow it. I'll burn the entire city before I allow anything to happen to her. Or to Mateo. Or to Mateo. Or to you. You're all I have now. You're everything." The months leading up to my due date were strange in their normality. Lucas still worked, but differently. Fewer nights away. More time at home. Mateo had started school at an elite private institution that Lucas's money had secured, and he came home excited about things like reading and mathematics, and a girl named Sophie who shared his lunch period. We fell into rhythms. Morning coffee in the kitchen while Mateo ate breakfast. Evenings when Lucas would read to me while I sat on the couch with my feet elevated, my belly enormous and demanding, my body preparing for the final transformation. My mother visited every weekend now. She'd bring groceries and sit with me and tell me stories about her own pregnancies, her own fears, her own journey toward accepting that love meant allowing yourself to be completely vulnerable to another person's existence. She'd touch my belly and talk to the baby inside me, and I'd watch Lucas observe this interaction, and I could see him understanding that Margaret was offering her blessing in the only way that mattered. David stopped by more frequently too. He'd bring Mateo home from school sometimes and stay for dinner. He and Lucas had developed a strange sort of understanding, a recognition of each other's boundaries that suggested respect, if not quite friendship. One evening, David pulled me aside while Lucas was helping Mateo with homework. "You're happy," he said. It was statement, not question. "Yes," I said. "I'm happy, even knowing what he is, especially knowing what he is, because he's trying to be something different, and that matters more than what he was." By the 9th month, everything was ready. The nursery was complete. Mateo understood that his life was about to transform. Lucas had put his affairs in order in ways that suggested preparation for something permanent. My body was ready. The baby was ready. We were all positioned at the edge of something that would change everything. On the night before my labor actually began, Lucas held me in bed and said something he'd never said before. "I love you. Not strategically, not as a tool, just completely. I love who you are and what you've chosen and what you're about to do. I love you." I fell asleep in his arms, knowing that this was the moment where everything had shifted from temporary to permanent, from contingent to absolute. The future was no longer something I was preparing to survive. It was something I was building. Labor started on a Tuesday morning at 4:30. I woke Lucas with a single word, and he was immediately conscious in the way people become conscious when they've been waiting for a specific moment for months. He had his phone in his hand before I'd finished explaining that the contractions were coming every 7 minutes. Before I could say anything else, the penthouse had transformed into coordinated action. David arrived first, which meant Lucas had called him before we'd even made it to the car. My brother had arranged to be available for exactly this reason, understanding that my labor would be a family moment, regardless of the circumstances that had created this family. Margaret arrived at the hospital while I was already in the delivery room, holding my mother's hand while Lucas paced between me and the door, unable to settle anywhere for longer than 30 seconds. The labor lasted 14 hours. Mateo had been induced after complications. This birth was the long, difficult kind that teaches you things about pain and endurance you didn't know your body could contain. Sometime around 6 p.m, when I was certain I couldn't continue, the doctor told me that the baby was in the perfect position, that it was time, that I needed to push. I pushed. Once, twice, 3 times. And then she existed outside of my body, outside of the theoretical. A small human, with Lucas's dark hair, and a cry that sounded like she was arguing with the universe itself. "She's perfect," the doctor said. "Completely healthy." They placed her on my chest, and I felt Lucas move closer. When I looked up at him, he was crying. Not silently, not with restraint. Completely, openly crying. His entire body shaking with sobs that sounded like he was releasing 3 years of grief he'd been storing in his bones. "Lucia," he said. "Her name is Lucia." I understood what he was doing. He was taking a ghost and transforming her into something real. He was refusing to let that name be a tomb and making it into a bridge. His daughter who died at 5 would exist now, not as tragedy, but as legacy. This baby who'd just been born would carry forward the name of the child he couldn't save, and in doing that, he was healing the only way he knew how. Mateo met his sister approximately 6 hours after she was born. We brought him into the recovery room where I was sitting up in bed, still bleeding and exhausted and overwhelmed by the physical reality of having expelled an entire human from my body. He entered very carefully, as if the room itself was sacred, which I suppose it was. He approached the small bassinet where Lucia slept, and he stood on his tiptoes to peer down at her. "She's so small," he whispered. "She'll get bigger," I said. "Like I did?" "Exactly like you did." Mateo reached out and touched her hand with one finger, testing whether she was real. When Lucia's tiny fingers closed around his, he looked back at Lucas with an expression of absolute wonder. He'd become a big brother. He'd been promoted in the family hierarchy. He was now responsible for something more fragile than himself. Lucas picked him up and held him while both of them looked at the sleeping baby. I watched the 3 of them, and I understood that we weren't a tool anymore. We weren't strategic. We were a family that had chosen each other through fire and blood and impossible circumstances. 1 year passed. Lucia's first birthday happened on a Tuesday, celebrated with a small cake that Mateo helped me bake, decorated with a single candle because she wouldn't understand the significance anyway. Lucas held her while she looked at the flame, completely fascinated by the dancing light. Mateo sang happy birthday off-key, and Margaret filmed the entire thing on her phone while David pretended he wasn't filming too. The penthouse had transformed into a home. There were toys everywhere now. Drawings Mateo had made taped to the refrigerator. Photos of all 4 of us on the walls. Evidence of lived experience instead of strategic display. When Lucas walked through the apartment now, he moved differently. His shoulders were less rigid. His jaw stayed unclenched for longer periods. He was becoming something that resembled a man at peace, or at least a man who'd learned to live alongside his own violence. Business had shifted, not disappeared, but transformed. Lucas had begun the process of stepping back, positioning a younger man named Antonio to gradually take control. The council had accepted this transition because Lucas had explained it in language they understood. Succession planning. Antonio was competent. The operations would continue. Lucas's influence would remain advisory if never absent. It was the kind of exit strategy that maintained power even while seeming to relinquish it. But I knew, because Lucas had told me in the darkness of our bedroom, that the exit was genuine, that in 5 years, he would hand everything to Antonio completely, that we would leave the city, or stay in it as invisible people, that Mateo would go to normal school, that Lucia would grow up believing her father was something ordinary. "I can't guarantee I'll be perfect," Lucas said one evening while we stood on the balcony watching the city perform its endless cycle of creation and destruction. "I can't guarantee that what I am won't somehow touch what we're building. But I can guarantee that I'm trying. Every single day, I'm trying to be better than I was. That's all any of us can do," I said. Sophia sent a package on Mateo's 6th birthday. Inside was a letter addressed to him, written carefully in Spanish so that he would need his father to translate it. She explained that she was proud of how strong he was, that she regretted leaving but couldn't have stayed, that she hoped Hannah was taking good care of him, which she clearly was, that she would always love him from a distance because some kinds of love required distance to remain pure. Lucas sat with Mateo while he read the letter translated, and he didn't cry this time. He'd learned how to process grief into something manageable. Mateo asked if his mother was sad. Lucas said yes, sometimes, but that her sadness was her responsibility, not Mateo's. That sometimes the people we love have to make choices that hurt, and our job is to survive those choices without letting them destroy us. Nearly 3 years had passed since I arrived. The timeline Lucas had promised was playing out. The triad incident had been resolved. Marco had settled into his exile in Palermo, occasionally sending postcards from places he visited that were carefully documented by Lucas's people. Slowly, he was becoming irrelevant. Not because Lucas had killed him, but because Lucas had removed the oxygen that kept Marco relevant. Without access to operations or counsel, Marco was just an aging man in Italy spending family money. My brother had eventually come to terms with what Lucas was. David attended the children's birthday parties. He brought Lucia presents. He taught Mateo how to throw a baseball properly. He existed in our life not as judgment but as family. His cop's perspective shifted by the reality of loving someone inside an impossible situation. My mother had become something like a grandmother to both children. She came to the penthouse 2 days a week and told them stories. She taught Mateo to read better. She held Lucia when she was teething and uncomfortable and couldn't be soothed by anyone else. One day, after putting both children down for nap, she pulled me aside. "He's a good father," she said simply. "He's trying to be." "That's the same thing," Margaret replied. "Trying is the whole point. The people who think they don't need to try are the dangerous ones, but the people who understand how much trying matters, they're salvageable." By year 3, we were completely normalized. Mateo attended school where nobody knew his father was anything other than a businessman. Lucia had learned to speak and took her first steps and discovered that she could manipulate every adult in her environment with a simple smile. I'd started consulting for translation projects discreetly, working from home, building something that resembled a career without the visibility that would complicate Lucas's transition. Lucas still worked, but less frequently. He spent more time at home. He attended school functions. He made breakfast on weekends while Mateo sat on the counter and talked about whatever had been occupying his mind that particular morning. He was becoming the thing he'd been afraid he couldn't be, an ordinary father. One night, standing in the penthouse balcony while both children slept, Lucas said something that suggested completion. "Thank you." "For what?" I asked. "For staying. For believing that this was possible. For making it real. We made it real together," I said. "No. You made it real. I just stopped destroying it." In the 5th year, the transition was complete. Antonio had full control of operations. Lucas had stepped away from the council. He maintained relationships and influence, the kind of soft power that could never truly disappear, but the daily management of the business belonged to someone else. He was still the shadow that everything revolved around, but he no longer had to maintain the facade of being present in the machinery. Matteo was 9 now. Lucia was 4, the same age Matteo had been when I first arrived. The parallels weren't lost on any of us. She had the same testing behaviors. She pushed boundaries with the same careful calculation. But the difference was that she had 2 parents and a big brother who'd learned how to recognize trauma in its earliest stages. She was healing before the damage could calcify. On Lucia's 4th birthday, Matteo held his sister's hand as she blew out her candles, and I watched Lucas watch them, and I saw something in his expression that suggested completion. His dead daughter had been honored through this living one. His son had survived. His family had transformed him. The man who'd entered my penthouse interview covered in the armor of violence had become someone capable of softness. David brought Margaret to the birthday celebration, and my mother stood beside Lucas while the children played, and she said something I overheard. "You're going to be okay, all of you." Lucas looked at her with something approaching gratitude. "Because of Hannah." "Because of all of you," Margaret corrected. "Hannah chose. Matteo chose. You chose. That's what makes it work. When everyone chooses, even from impossible positions, that's when transformation becomes real." As the evening dissolved into darkness, Lucia fell asleep on Lucas's chest, while he sat in the leather chair that had become his, reading to Matteo, who was old enough now to understand complex sentences, but young enough to still want his father's voice. I watched them from the doorway, and understood that we'd survived something that should have destroyed us. That love, measured by the context we were actually living in, rather than normal standards, was powerful enough to reshape everything. That staying had been the right choice, not because it was safe, but because it mattered. The future stretched ahead of us. Lucas would eventually be completely removed from operations. We would become invisible. The penthouse would remain ours, or we'd move somewhere else where nobody knew who we'd been. Matteo would become whatever he chose to become, without the weight of legacy dragging him down. Lucia would grow up believing her father was ordinary, and I would stay, because I'd already chosen, because love demanded presence, because this family, this impossible, violent, reconstructed family, had become real enough to merit commitment.